I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm so excited to be joined by the wonderful Seth Meyers to talk about Late Night with Seth Meyers. And one of the things that I wanted to start off talking about was the comedy swings that you take on the show, because I've heard you describe that you felt like at the beginning, some of the bigger comedy swings didn't feel earned yet. And now that
Yeah.
you've been doing the show for over 10 years, I was really interested in how you approach the comedy and the idea of bigger swings a little bit differently than you used to.
Yeah. Looking back, I realized the first step in having one of these shows is earning the audience's trust. And I incorrectly assumed that trust would transfer over from SNL. And the reality is, it was a different time slot, it was a different kind of show. And there needed to be competency before there was, as I said, wild swings. And so, I think we had this sort of recalibration maybe 6 months in where we understood that we had to show them we could do a talk show before we could fully lean into making it the talk show we wanted to make it. And, it was a silver lining to a terrible thing, but the pandemic and doing a show in an attic and doing a show back in the studio with no audience, that probably led to our wildest swings. And we were very happy when we went back to normal that the audience was sort of there with us for those choices.
Yeah. And I love that you were mentioning that it was about 6 months in that you were starting to kind of go, okay, maybe we need to recalibrate some of this, because when you started the show, Lorne Michaels had said to you, it's going to take you 18 months to find your
Yeah.
feet. And
Yeah.
18 months in is when you first sat down behind the desk for the monologue. And how do you feel like those shifts that you made in the first kind of year and a half kind of really brought you this level of comfort and confidence, because you had that at SNL and you had to rebuild it from the foundation doing this?
Yeah, it's so funny how sometimes the things that make the biggest change are the smallest choices. I don't think anybody thought it was incredibly novel to just start at the desk, but it made a massive difference in my comfort. And so much of these shows is about how well you present your comfort to the audience. And you can write all day and you can say to yourself, these are really good jokes and people are going to really like hearing them. But if they don't see a level of ease and a level of calm from you, then it's just too stressful to watch that at 12:30 on a weeknight. And so there were, these small things. I'll start behind a desk. I feel comfortable behind a desk. And then, the show just ironically, because I was now off my feet, the show was on much better footing. Once we got off my feet, the show was on good feet.
And you bring up that idea of it's about projecting the comfort that you have to the audience. But I also think one of the things that you do on the show so well is you project how much fun you're having, and you allow the enjoyment and the passion to really be front and center of the show. Was that something that you ever consciously thought about, or did that just naturally come through from the beginning?
It just not. I mean, I just remember that the first few years of the show, after every segment, after every show, I would say to my head writer Alex Bays or my executive producer Mike Shoemaker, "That was good, right? Was that good? Was that a good show?" And now my sense is that was good. I don't, and because I have this internal belief now that we do good work, it is really fun. And the working on the show is fun, but also stressful. And because it's stressful, and because we put hard work in the time leading up to when we start taping, the taping is almost entirely good times. And allowing myself to project the authentic fun I'm having has been a huge difference. And I think both how the show is performed and received.
And with you bringing up Mike Shoemaker as well, when you first started out, you kind of described how part of your feeling of I can do this is if I have him, then I feel confident that I can do it. And I was just curious about how your relationship has really grown and evolved over 10 years with
I
him being the central
Yeah,
trust to it beginning.
I think I think it's been real flat. Like as far as an evolution is gone, like we haven't developed much because we were in a place where it was really good when we started. I think if anything, we allowed the show to evolve to meet the kind of working relationship we have. And one of those things is Shoemaker makes decisions really quickly. And I have a tendency to hem and haw over things. And I love being around people who make decisions with authority. Shoemaker is like that. My wife is like that. And for somebody like me, I could entirely waste my life trying to decide between two things. Whereas Shoemaker will just walk into my office at 10 and said, he'll just say, where you can either do 2 segments with this guest and one with this or the other way around, but I'm going to do the first one because this. And I'm like, great. Like by the time I can say that's good, he's left my office. And that just allows me to focus on the parts of the show that I'm better at, which is, in the writing of it. And it's just a really wonderful partnership that's based on trust, not just, about all things, but taste. When you trust your partner on taste, it makes life a lot easier because those are the conversations that can eat up too much time.
Yeah. And speaking of the writing and talking a little bit about surprise inspections, where you basically take some of the jokes that were rejected from the pile and bring them into the foreground on the show. I was interested in just like how when we hear those, you're obviously making fun of this really doesn't work, the punchline doesn't land, but those are the jokes that get you to the jokes on air. And just when you're in the writer's room, the importance of being in a space where everybody can throw out ideas that might not necessarily be good, that might not work, but how that gets you the level of the show that you do.
Yeah, the great thing about surprise inspection, which was Alex Bayes' idea, is it only works because the audience believes I love my writing staff. And again, like that's an equity we've built up over the course of the show. I think people watch our show know that it's a writer's show. They know that we put a lot of time into the writing. And then over the course of the pandemic, when there was no one around, I started talking about not just my crew, but my writing staff by name. There was no one else to interact with. And so we slowly, we didn't force it, but over a decade, people know who Amber is. People know who Mike Scollins is. People, know who Ben Warhite is. And then, I can be mean about their bad jokes in a way that people watching at home know, oh, these are friends busting on each other. And it is fun to watch that. It's you know, I think a lot of it comes from, I don't know, it feels very New England to me. I just watched that new Casey Affleck Matt Damon movie, The Instigators, and there's a sort of Boston ribbing that I think is very fun to watch. I mean, obviously I'm a little biased coming from New England, but I think that's at the heart of surprise inspection, excuse me. It's surprise infection. That's what I hope Scollins gets. But surprise inspection is like, oh, look at this. These people love one another, and then the meanness is obviously in jest.
And obviously, when you first hired the writer's room, that was such a unique place to be in because that was the one time that you got to hire everybody together for the first time and everybody was new to it. And I love the way that you've hired from very different places with you and your team. There's been people from social media, someone who's on TikTok who doesn't even live in New York that all of a sudden has a job on Late Night with Seth Meyers. How has it changed the way that you're looking for specific skill sets in different ways to bring people into the team, knowing that you already have this amazing group of writers at the helm?
Well, for example, I think our last hire was Jeff Wright, who was entirely from TikTok. We'd seen his videos. He was really funny. We knew he was incredibly charismatic as a performer, but also, when you see a TikTok video, you're dealing with somebody who also knows how to write, knows how to edit, knows how to self-start. And that's such an important part of a show like this, because when you're up and running, when the show knows what it is, it's actually harder for a new writer to, stake a claim. And the only way they're going to do it is if you hire somebody who's not doing what you already have. And so we're always looking for differences there. And then, one of the other really rewarding things about this show, having been on for 10 years, is at this point, we've had former writers who've come back as, guests, be it, Michelle Wolf or Seth Reese, who still writes for our show, came on because he co-wrote The Menu, which is a great movie. And then this week, Connor O'Malley, who was one of our first hires, is coming back because he had a great stand-up special. And so it's really nice when you do this long enough that the people who started with you are now doing things that dwarf what it was that they actually did here.
Yeah, it's a really special space to be in. And I also wanted to ask about writing the recent segment that you did, because you just had a 3-week hiatus.
Yeah.
And obviously quite a lot happened politically with the election during that time.
Yeah.
Biden stood down, Kamala Harris became the floor leader. And so I was just interested in sitting with your writer's room and kind of addressing, how do we bring the show back when so much has happened? And we don't necessarily need to do a closer look on all of this because it's been covered, but we wanted to touch upon it because it was such a great segment.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's just you realize that, one thing I think we really do and it's all due to Sal Gentile, the head writer of A Closer Look. He processes for people like what the news means. And yet sometimes he understands. I think today we just have to sort of revel in how much happened over the course of 3 weeks. And so there was a real, I mean, again, sometimes just a list is really funny, a true list, which is all it was. Because, yeah, it would be mindless to try to, actually cover it all and be granular as what it all means. Whereas sometimes just it's really fun to own up to the fact. And again, we're like letting the audience behind the curtain. They know that we're going to write about it, and they're very curious to see what we have to say. And they delight in the fact that in the end, all we could really do is just say, "Can you believe everything that happened?" But it's really always nice. People say, "Is it a bummer when you miss big news?" I think now our relationship with the audience is such that as long as you're going to eventually do another show, you're going to have that release. You just have to wait for it a little bit longer. And again, don't get me wrong, we were all walking around and muttering. But the last 2 weeks, um, there was a whole different, the world changed in a way that I think for a lot of people, it was a time for like optimism. Obviously I'm apolitical. I don't feel one way or the other about any of this.
You've never expressed any political opinions ever.
No, no, no. That's why. I mean, I know it's very frustrating for people to watch my show to not know where I stand on things, but that's how I've chosen to be.
I did want to ask, because you were pointing out that Kamala Harris and her campaign are referring to the Trump campaign as weird and weird
Yeah,
people. And you pointed out that you've actually been doing that for years. And I
we
was
have been
curious,
saying weird for a long time.
who was the person on the team that realized, wait, we've been doing that all along. We should edit together a montage and do this as a piece?
Oh, I mean, immediately Sal. Sal was so delighted because again, he, credit for me saying weird is from Sal writing weird. And I wrote him, I will say I wrote and suggested, hey, we should cut together. And he was the speed in which he texted back. Oh, we are already doing that. I'm like, okay. You get all the credit. But yeah, he and Emily Rodas, and who's his partner in crime, she's produces A Closer Look. The two of them, I think, as soon as they clocked that weird was a thing, started digging through the archives, and it wasn't hard to find.
And you were bringing up that obviously there's always that moment of, if we can't fit something in the show tonight, we have another show tomorrow.
Yeah.
And what do those conversations look like with your team? Because I imagine it's a very case by case basis of, do we try to re-record something? Do we rewrite something? Do we try to fit this in tonight? Or is this something that potentially we don't need to worry about until tomorrow and we can talk about it more in depth?
Yeah. So again, this all is again the benefit of doing a show for this long, because it's not just that you get better at things. It's also that your audience, your loyal audience, starts to learn how we approach it. And so I think if a major late breaking news story isn't in the show, I am confident our audience is savvy enough to know the reason was it happened after we taped. And so whereas early in the run of the show, I think we panicked a lot. I think we were always worried about what our talented colleagues in the field were doing. Oh, they got to it and we didn't get to it. And now I think we've managed to like let that go in a very healthy way. And the other thing is, sometimes you say, we'll get to it tomorrow. But we also live in a day and age where you think you'll get to it tomorrow, but then by tomorrow, 3 other things have happened. And, was it maybe blessed to live in uninteresting times? That is not a blessing that has been uninteresting times. Could we have certainly, volume is not an issue for us. We're never worried about how we're going to fill an hour. And so it's funny, even in the course of 24 hours, how you think, we missed that story, but that's okay. We'll get to it tomorrow. And then the next day rolls around and you're like, we're not going to get to it anymore. Right. And so when you realize how quickly a story isn't a story anymore, it allows you to forgive yourself for not getting to it in the first place.
Because there's also the element of, it's not just a case of rewriting something. It has to go through several people and it has to go through the legal team. And I kind of love how you've been making every time there's a reference to JD Vance and saying he did not have relations with a couch, we just have to be explicitly clear, how you're able to use the legalese of the show to make humor from. And is that something that you quite enjoy doing and playing around with?
Yeah. And there is, I think for people who are sticking with late night as a format, there's always been a fun, from, certainly Carson, Letterman, Conan, John Oliver now, they all talk about what hoops you have to jump through for a network, be it legal, be it in marketing, be it in promotion. And so when that becomes part of your show, it is really fun because the audience is on your side. You know, there's a lot of like, oh, the brass, uh, and they sort of, I think a lot of it's play acting, but they play acting share your lament with the way you're being treated by the network, even when, of course, you're exaggerating it for comic effect.
Yeah. I also want to talk about corrections
Thank you.
and your
Finally.
wonderful, wonderful jackals.
Yes.
Because I was very curious. You're the one that's sitting there and scrolling through hundreds and hundreds and
Yeah.
hundreds of YouTube comments. Has doing that segment changed the way that people comment on your videos and comment on the show, knowing that you're going into it and you're digging through it for this segment?
Yes, I think because there is now a segment of the show that only works because people write me corrections and people enjoy that segment of the show. Now, if someone sees me make a mistake, no matter how small, almost as a favor to me, they run to the YouTube section to say, "Hey, you dummy, you fucked up." And then I have to, but it's the bummer then is when I make a small mistake, 200 people are now in the comments checking, pointing it out. And so it really stings now. When I mess up less and fewer, I know I'm going to hear about it. No fewer than a billion times and no less than a million.
So sometimes it's things where you're hoping that they'll pick up on it, and sometimes it's things where they're pointing out things you would love to just brush under the rug.
Yes. And by the way, I'm never on, there's never anything I'm hoping they'll pick up. But the most delightful corrections comments are ones that are genuinely off the wall correct, but something that only, for example, a super fan of subway cars, that when you make a joke about the L train and then someone writes and says the L train has never had uh, that color seats. And, because that, of course, opens up a whole new area because now eventually what you're doing is talking about people who know that much about subways.
Yeah. I also wanted to talk about the way in which you bring guests onto the show, because when you were on Watch What Happens Live with Andy, you kind of admitted there are times where I've said no to having someone as a guest, or I haven't wanted them if they've been unpleasant to me, but also to people that I know. And I thought
Yeah.
that was such a great point of it's also being very protective of the environment that you've created for your entire team of how is someone going to come into the show and treat everybody around me as much as me, the host. And I was just interested in the way that you said about doing that.
Yeah, I think something that dawns on you, and it's a very important thing, is when you are a talk show host, and then because of that, to some degree, a gatekeeper to people who can be guests on your show, you sort of get the best of everyone. I think that there may be difficult people in this business, maybe difficult people, young people who are coming up in this business who are very polite to me. And then you hear after the fact that they were actually very rude to everybody else. I don't leave that interaction thinking, well, they were nice to me, so I don't know what you guys all did wrong. I think I see it as, oh, that was they faked it on my behalf, and because it was transactional. And so, those aren't really the kind of people, mostly because, look, there's so many people that, especially when you have the 12:30 show, you have this lovely situation where a lot of people, it's their first show that they ever get a chance to do in late night television. And since there's a long line of people we'd like to have, there's no reason to go back to the well for someone who chose to be difficult in the moment. And at the same time, I should say, like, I forgive anyone for being nervous or stressed out the first time they're on a talk show. And I do want people to know, as I'm saying this, like, we are able to make the distinction between someone who was nervous and someone who was mean, because we're not just trying to, we're not out there, trying to punish people for having anxiety. I certainly, look back at the early times where I was backstage on a talk show, and I can imagine I maybe came off as cold when I was really just melting down inside.
And you also bring up that there are so many times where it's somebody's first time being on any sort of late night show as well. And what's the difference for you in terms of that? Because obviously you're always trying to make your guests feel really, really comfortable and at ease. But also in that instance, you're also contextualizing things sometimes for the audience a little bit more. There's guests that if you have Amy Poehler or Joe Biden, everybody knows who they are, but sometimes you're giving the audience that little bit of background and making sure that the stories that they tell do that as well.
Yeah, and it's so fun. I really genuinely love when it's somebody's first talk show and they have this enthusiasm about it that's so contagious. It almost reminds you how lucky you are to have a show like this. We had this wonderful actress, Myhala, was on Industry, and it was like she was shot out of a cannon when she came out, and then she was just an incredible storyteller, and you could just feel the audience, a half of whom I'm sure have seen and loved her show, and the other half who were just so delighted to be meeting her in this context. And so I never take for granted how special it is that, on any given night, there are three people coming through or two people coming through. Some are old friends, some are people you've respected for the entirety of your life, and some you're meeting for the first time. And it's so great to be able to give them that opportunity.
It also sounds like no matter who the guest is, that first and foremost, you're making sure that they feel really comfortable and at ease with what they're talking about, the stories that they're telling. And it's never, let's try to grab something that could make a great clip or make a great headline. And I think the Kellyanne Conway example is such a great one, because that was the day that the dossier with the
Yeah.
potential of the Trump P tape came out. And you made a point of going, I want to ask her about it, but I want to make sure that she's seen the story first rather than her being asked
Yes.
about it for the first time on air.
Yeah, and that was obviously very unique, but it truly did break too close to her coming on stage for even her to have known, you know. So we knew it would be deeply unfair. It wasn't like a dereliction of her duty that she didn't know that story. It was like literally like 15 minutes before she came out. And so yeah, we do always. And we're not the kind of show that we have a lot of guests that where the goal is to be contentious. That I found that just like emotionally took too much out of me, be it, and I think sometimes it makes for good television, but it didn't feel like I don't know, it wasn't the vibe our show wanted to cultivate. So in general, like, yeah, when you have people out, and it's not just, I should note, like, I'm kind of the last stop on that. Let's make the guests feel comfortable. We have incredible researchers, we have incredible segment producers. And I think sometimes people underestimate what a village it takes for a talk show appearance to go well. And that's not to mean that it's scripted or totally, beat for beat thought out, but you got to do a lot of work. I have to have a lot of prep for it to be sort of authentic and loose in the moment. And we do sort of aim for looseness, but the looseness can't start with me not knowing anything and saying, so tell me, industry, what's that? What's that about? So I'm glad it shows up on camera.
Do you feel like you have a natural instinct now for knowing that level of making sure that you're using all the information that your research team have to be really, really prepared? But I've heard you say that you don't like to be too prepared at the same time.
I bet if I went back and watched early episodes, I guarantee you my first note would be that my questions were too long, if that makes sense. I would just ask a really long question that had maybe four questions within the body of the question. And that was all me sort of thinking it was impressive to the audience that I had all this information at the ready. And so now, again, it's a learned skill, but you try to talk less and wait for there to be a moment where I can add value to someone else's appearance. And the fun thing is also the longer you do this, you realize there's 1,000 different kinds of talk show guests. One of my favorite things is realizing that certain people show up and look at you and it's just locked eye contact as if no one else is there. And other people play the whole thing out. They're theater performers. And so you ask them a question and then they answer to them, which is also fascinating, and both work. And I think the show would be worse if people were only doing it one way. So the more styles that the guests bring, the better the show is.
Do you find that still, even 10 years in, that you still have those constant moments of, even though I'm the host and I kind of know the setup I'm going to create, the questions I'm going to ask, that you still never really know where a segment's going to go until you're in it? Because, I don't know where we're going with this because it's all based on your answers.
Yeah. I mean, and also the fun, and sometimes it's hard. Sometimes you have somebody like Eddie Murphy, right? And you kind of can't believe the whole time you're talking to Eddie Murphy, you can't believe you're talking to Eddie Murphy. And there's no way to make yourself believe you're talking to Eddie Murphy other than the fact that he's there. And you have all these things you want to ask Eddie Murphy, but then now all of a sudden Eddie Murphy is talking about being at Studio 54 with Yul Brynner. And now you're just in your head realizing you have to throw out everything because if Eddie Murphy in this moment is telling this story, that's because he knows this is the best story for this moment. And so the last thing you ever want to say to a legend is, oh, that's so funny. I'd like to get back to what I was asking. Like, like you have to realize like what you were asking, what your plan was, oftentimes has to take a back seat to what an incredibly adept storyteller and performer has chosen to do.
Yeah. I also wanted to talk a little bit about day drinking with Seth because
Yeah.
it's such a wonderful segment, and I love the genesis of it being you and your brother doing a field segment together. Because when you do field segments, you get a little bit nervous, and the alcohol
Yeah.
helps calm you.
Yeah.
And what's that experience of looking back at the genesis of what that segment started as, and then looking at some of the more recent ones that you've done?
It's so I mean that's a real best laid plans go out the window because it is sort of like, hey, we're gonna go get super wasted and here's all the things I'd like to get done. And so those two are in obviously direct competition with one another. The great thing about it, and again, it's kind of a through line of this interview, right? The longer you do the show, the more the audience knows what to expect, and now what the guests know what to expect. And so, the longer you do day drinking, the more people show up who are game for what it can be. And, so it helps that they've seen Rihanna, and then, it helps that they've seen Dua Lipa, and it helps that they've seen Lizzo, and everybody sort of brings uh, a very fun vibe to it. And again, the only thing I wish is that it was as easy to keep doing as like something as fun as carpool karaoke, right? Because like no one ever took like James Corden aside and says, "Hey man, if you sing this much, your liver's going to explode." Whereas like that is actually a problem with day drinking.
Because you actually edit out some of the drinks that you have
Yeah.
because it would look too extreme, right?
Yeah, we've got one coming up, and I'm sort of telling the writers now, like you have to remember that feeling when we're in the studio showing it for the first time. Like I don't want those moments where the audience is like, oh, like that's not what we're trying to do. This is not, I am being a jackass, but this is not jackass.
Are there ever moments in day drinking that you wish you had edited out? And specifically, when you told Dua Lipa, which is your favorite kid?
Oh, I mean, I have this weird projection into the future where all my kids are going to understand comedy. And if they don't, I do think it's going to be a pretty big therapy bill. But I kind of, the weird thing is waking up the morning after day drinking, or sometimes just the middle of the night, the way you would if you had just gotten hammered at a social occasion. It's just exactly that. You wake up and you're like, oh, what did I say? And I can't. Shoemaker watches the first cut because I am so nervous about it. And there are times where I maybe want to cut something, but the writers, if it's really funny, the writers will prevail.
What is that experience generally for you when you watch the cut of day drinking for the first time? Because
I mean,
it's
I watch
reliving a
it. I mean, I
hangover.
watch it through my fingers. It's a disaster. Because again, I'm although I've gotten better over the years, I think I have writer brain, and it's taken years for me to like sort of let my performer brain be in charge during the performance of the show. But writer brain during day drinking, like for the first half hour of day drinking, is constantly saying, "What is any of this funny? Is any of this good?" And then I drink enough, and writer brain goes to bed. But then the next day, writer brain is back awake and also very hungover, watching and saying, like, "Who is this guy? This guy's a dope." And well, it's just trying to synthesize all that in one viewing.
And when you look back at when you first started doing this show 10 years ago, and just that idea of having to develop a whole new set of instincts in a different format, how does it feel to now be in a place where you have this really solidified sense of instinct and confidence in the show that you're putting out every night?
It's really, look, I think just knowing what it is you want to do every day is such a relief because when you start the show, you you just are like trying to figure out what it is you want to do. And so that puts a whole extra burden on every day. So, we've got a Monday show today while we're talking, and there'll be a long, closer look. But whether it's up to the quality that we aim for or comes a little underneath, at least we know our goal today is to do a great closer look. Whereas, 8 years ago, we would be sitting here saying, well, we've got this one desk piece about, uh, famous first drafts. And then we have this other desk piece. And, there were funny bits in all of those, but it just felt like we were, at least I know where the dartboard is now, I guess. Whereas I used to just have a blindfold on and was just chucking darts all around the room.
I love that. Well, it's such a fantastic show, and I always love talking to you about it. So thank you so much, Seth. I really appreciate it.
You're very good at this. You're really top shelf. Let me just say, when you ask me about interviewing, I just want you to know I'm taking a lot of tips from you over the course of this last half hour.
Oh my gosh. I'm just going to ride that high for the rest of the week. Thank
The
you.
one question you didn't ask that I'll answer for viewers, if I had remembered half an hour ago this was on Zoom, would I have shaved? And I think the answer is probably yes. But I only remembered 5 minutes, and I think there's just no, I've never done a 5-minute shave where there wasn't
Disaster.
There wasn't blood. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for not shaving and talking
yes.
about that.
Thank you so much.